Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. Today is day 67, and we're learning today how to tell time. So, a rather technical lesson today. It's not particularly exciting, but of course, rather useful. And we're continuing to work with the numbers we've learned, including some new case forms of numbers. We mentioned briefly, and it was actually kind of a warning, right, that in book 4, we'll learn how to decline numbers, that almost all the numbers are basically nouns that have a full set of case endings, and they decline like any other noun would. But a lot of those forms aren't used too often in everyday speech. The major exception probably is the genitive, right? So we'll see some examples today of how the genitive is used quite often, for example, in time expressions and whatnot. So let's start out with something simple, right? Stating time on the hour in Russian. So this is fairly simple. And today we're answering the question, "Сколько сейчас времени?" Right? How much time is it now? Or if we look more closely, "Сколько," right? We're asking about quantity, how much, and so we get a genitive, how much of time. "Сколько времени?" Now, время, the noun for time, is a strange type of noun in Russian. I think we've seen a couple of these already, like imя. For example, there are some neuter nouns that end in mya, but then of course the final letter is ya, and so they look like feminines, but they're actually neuter, and there are maybe 10 or so of these that are fairly common. And again, we'll look at this topic again in book 4 in more detail. But for now, let's just learn this expression, "Сколько сейчас времени?" How much of time? Сейчас, and then we'll state the time on the hour, right? Which is very easy. We're just using numbers, and we're combining it with the forms of час that we would expect, right? Один час, два часа, 3 часа, 4 часа, right? So 2, 3, 4 are followed by genitive singular. Note the stress on that in these time expressions. Часа, these time expressions get in stress. And 5 and above, we get genitive plural, as we would expect. 5 часов, 6 часов, 7 часов, 8 часов, 9 часов, 10 часов, 11, 12 часов. Okay, so that's very easy. Nothing new there really at all. Okay, so what if we want to be more exact, right? Well, there's one very easy way to do that in Russian. We just basically read out the time, like we would say in English, like it's 101, 202, 304, or whatever, right? So how would we do that? Well, we just split up the hour and the minutes and use them the way we learned yesterday, right? Один час, одна минута, right? One hour, 1 minute. Два часа, 2 минуты. 2 hours, 2 minutes. 3 часа, 4 минуты, for example, right? So again, 2, 3, 4, followed by genitive singular, but then 5 and above, genitive plural. So for example, 4 часа, 5 минут, right? 5 minutes. There we have minuta and the genitive plural, 0 ending. 5 часов, 30 минут. So 5 hours, 30 minutes. Okay, so obviously this is very easy, right? And so this is a good kind of crutch to remember if you don't remember what we're going to learn here in a moment, right? The more complicated way that Russians would actually normally use to tell time. Now, again, it's not that they never do it this way, but I guess the bottom line is we need to learn both ways, right? Because you may get both from Russians. But again, in terms of learning the language, this simple way is obviously much easier. But we're going to push ahead here in a moment and learn the trickier way. Now, before we do that, let's talk about how we specify the time of day in Russian, right? They don't really say AM and PM the way we do. Instead, they tend to give the time of day using nouns that I think we've already seen. I think we've seen most of these already. Утро, день, вечер, ночь. Okay, so morning, day, evening, and notch, which, by the way, this is a rather important thing to note. We say in English all the time things like, "What are you doing tonight?" And what we really mean, at least from the Russian point of view, is what are you doing this evening, right? Unless you have plans for very late at night or very early in the morning, right? You use вечер in Russian, right? So again, we would only use notch if we meant like very late, like basically around midnight, past midnight, very early in the morning. That's when we'd use notch in Russian. Okay, so basically, if we're simply saying in the morning, during the day, in the evening, etc., we get the instrumental. And so that's a time expression. We know already that time expressions can use any number of different cases, just depending on the expression. And we're going to review that more, I think, tomorrow, right? So So for today, let's just note that if you're simply saying in the morning, etc., you simply use the instrumental утром, днем, вечером, ночью. But if you're using these times of day to specify what time of day, the way we would use AM or PM, then you get the genitive, right? For example, 7 часов утра, right? Literally 7 hours of the morning, right? So that makes good sense, right? Of the morning, of the day, of evening, etc. 2 часа дня, 8 часов вечера, 3 часа ночи. By the way, a lot of times Russians, I think, would leave out the nya because usually that's kind of the default, right? If you mean in the middle of the day, you just say 2 часа, right? And obviously people would normally assume you mean 2 p.m. and not 2 a.m., right? So the nya there is kind of optional. Let's look at a poster quickly. В пору рабочую пашут и ночью. So during working season, when it's time to work, they literally they plow even at night. Right, pachat means literally to plow. Sometimes Russians will use that as a kind of slang for just working in general. I've heard that used, pachat. So here this guy's literally plowing, but I guess it could be understood more broadly, right? We work even at night, ночью, и ночью. Okay, so now that we know how to specify AM and PM, let's look now at how to tell time the way Russians, I think, normally would, right? Again, you always have the simpler method, but at any rate, we definitely need to learn this method. And of course, this gets more complicated. Okay, so we saw already how to tell time on the hour. That's very easy if it's right on the hour. If it's off the hour, then we kind of split up into two different models. So let's take first the first half of the hour, right? From whatever, 12:01 to 12:30 or whatever it is. So the first half of the hour, we start by stating the minutes. Right, so the minutes come first, which is already maybe a little bit counterintuitive. So for example, 1 минута, 2 минуты, 5 минут, 10 минут, 15 минут, so 15 minutes. Or for 15, we can also use a quarter, which in Russian is четверть. That's an e noun in Russian, a feminine e noun, четверть. You can see it's related to четыре. And then if we get to the halfway mark, right, 30 minut, we could say, but Russians would normally say половина, right, which it's a noun simply meaning half. Okay, so we simply state the minutes, and again, we use the same formula we learned yesterday, right? 2, 3, 4 would take genitive singular, 5 and above, genitive plural. And then we add of the first, second, third, fourth hour. Okay, so a couple of things here. First of all, we're using the ordinal forms of the numbers, right? These adjectival ordinal forms, meaning not 1, 2, 3, but first, second, third, etc. Right? So there's one thing. The other thing that is, I think, very confusing in some way is that, we look at the numbers, we see 12:01, for example. But if we think about it, if it's 12:01, 12:02, etc., we're in the first hour, right? We're getting into the first hour. Or maybe it's a bit clearer, let's go to 1:02, right? We're 2 minutes into the second hour, right? So we end up saying not one, but we say 2 minutes of the second because we're already into the second hour. That is the hour past 1. So I think you'll agree that that's really very confusing, and it's one of those things, to me at least, that it's quite simple. Obviously, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what's going on, but it's very counterintuitive, and it can make telling time and understanding time expressions just a little bit tricky. So this definitely takes some getting used to. Okay, so again, reading out now the full expressions. 12:01 would be 1 minuta первого, 2 minuty второго would be 1:02. 2:05, we're saying again 5 minutes of the third hour. By the way, часа is understood basically. 5 minut третьего. 3:10 would be 10 minutes of the fourth. 10 minut четвертого, and so on. By the way, when we get to 6:30, we can say половина седьмого, right, half of the seventh. Or we can use a kind of contracted form of that expression, полседьмого. Полседьмого, and you can see it's just a contracted form from половина. We get pol, and we would write that as a single word. Okay, now again, if we wanted to specify A and PM, we would use the of the morning, of day, of evening, of night expressions we just learned a moment ago. Okay, so let's practice this a little bit. And remember, this is really, I think, kind of backwards for English speakers. It's not easy. So remember to start with the numbers, and then we're saying of the whatever hour, first, second, third, fourth, but we're kind of jumping ahead an hour in our English minds, I guess, right? So look at 401. We're going to be saying 1 minute of the fifth, right? So одна minuta пятого, right? Remember your ordinal forms. You might need to review those. Одна minuta пятого. And then if we want to make clear this is PM, okay, we need to think, well, by the way, there's sort of some gray territory here sometimes. I guess it depends on how you think about it. But I guess we could probably say nya here, nya, right? 4 a.m., 4 p.m., meaning, right, одна minuta пятого дня. Again, there, the nya is really optional because we would assume you're talking about 4 p.m., not 4 a.m. Okay, what about 5 a.m.? So start with the minutes. 3 minuti шестого. See, I almost goofed, right? 3 minuti шестого. Okay, this will be morning, so we would say утра, утра. Right? So this isn't just in the middle of the night, right? But we'd think early morning, утра. Okay, 1:15 a.m. That's very early morning. This is going to be ночь. So 15 минут второго ночью. Or we could say четверть, right? A quarter, четверть второго ночи. I think I misspoke a moment ago. Ночи, we'd say, right? With the time expression. So 1:15 of night, literally. Now, again, you could say ночью, but that means at night. And so you wouldn't normally use that right together here with the time expression. Okay, 2 p.m. Okay, so here we're on the hour. This is easy, right? Два часа. And we'd say дня if we wanted to. Два часа. Okay, 2:30 p.m. Okay, that's going to be половина, right? Half. We're at the halfway mark. Половина третьего or полтретьего. Полтретьего in the contracted version. And again, if we had to be clear, we could say дня of day. 12:02. So 2 минуты, right? 2 minutes. 2 минуты. Первого, right? We're now into the first hour, so to speak. 2 минуты первого and AM. Okay, so that's very early morning. That would be ночи, right? 2 минуты первого ночи. 6 p.m. We're on the hour. That's easy. 6 часов вечера, we could say, right? Of the evening. 8:29 p.m. 29 минут девятого вечера, right? That's still evening, right? We would say of the evening, вечера. 9:21 a.m. in the morning, right? So start with the minutes. 21 минута 10 утра. Okay, 1 a.m. So again, early morning on the hour. Час, right? So you could say один час, but normally for one, you would just simply say час, right? Час ночи. We'd say час ночи. 6:30 p.m. So половина, right? Halfway. Половина седьмого вечера or полседьмого. The contracted form полседьмого вечера. 10:24 a.m., right? So we have how many minutes? 24 минуты 11, right? So 24 minutes of the 11th. We're in the a.m., so we'd say утра. Okay, 11 p.m. 11 часов, right? That's easy. 11 часов. And here I would probably say вечера, I suppose, but again, we're getting pretty late, so but I would still say вечера. Okay, let's see, 11:30 a.m. Половина 12 утра, right? Or полдвенадцатого утра. Okay, let's see. What about the genitive forms of numbers? Let's learn this quickly. We're going to need these for the second half of the clock face here in telling time. Okay, again, we mentioned already that numbers unfortunately decline. They have a full set of case endings, and again, the most common form, aside from the nominative that we've learned, is the genitive. Right, so here they are, and look at the forms in the black box. Those are irregular. Right, all of the others are actually e-nouns. So this isn't actually quite as difficult, at least not in these examples, as you might fear. Right, from один we get одного, одна we get одной. Those are adjectival, as we know, right? So they're we get those adjectival genitive endings. 2, 3, 4 are irregular. Right, so they're gonna eventually we're gonna have to learn just a full set of endings for them that are completely unpredictable. We get dwóch, troch, czterech. Okay, and then the remaining numbers are e nouns. That means in the genitive that we're going to get e. A lot of the single digits, I guess all of them actually have that ending stressed, right? So пяти, шести, семи, восьми, девяти, десяти. If you look over the third column, and then let's continue with the tens, right? 20, 30, etc. These are all e nouns. Двадцати, тридцати. Okay, let's back up and look at the teens. These are also e nouns, but they don't have in stressed, right? In stress. So одиннадцати, двенадцати, тринадцати, четырнадцати, пятнадцати, шестнадцати, семнадцати, восемнадцати, девятнадцати. So a bit of a mouthful, but the forms themselves aren't too difficult. Now, let's go back to the third column, 50, 60, etc., right? These tens, they're a little bit tricky because if we think about it, they're built up really of two numbers, right? Пять, десять, right? Пятьдесят, sort of 5 and 10. So basically both elements of these numbers decline, right? So we get пятидесяти, and note the stress, пятидесяти. So basically two genitive forms here combined into one word. Шестидесяти, семидесяти, восьмидесяти. And then девяносто is acting, I guess, basically like a neuter noun. Девяносто will be the девяносто, the genitive form. Okay, so why are these so useful? Well, for one thing, people give approximate times a lot, right? So to do that, to give approximate times or approximate numbers for that matter, you would use около. Около, which takes the genitive and it means about, approximately, about, whatever, right? So около одной минуты would mean around 1 minute. Две минуты, 2 minutes. If we want to say about 2 minutes for around 2 minutes, well, all of that 2 minutes, that whole phrase is going to have to go into the genitive, right? And so we get около двух минут. Okay, so let's practice some of these. And so again, we could use these with actual times, or we could with numbers, generally speaking, right, to say approximately how much we have of whatever. Okay, so and of course you get this all the time in everyday speech. So around 5 would be около пяти. Около пяти. What about around 2? Около двух. Около двух. Around 1, okay, if that refers to a time, the noun is час, so we're going to get a masculine form. That would be около одного. Or actually here I misspoke a bit. We'd say около часа if we're telling time, right? Около часа. Okay, sorry. 7. So около семи. Около семи, note the stress. Around 11, около одиннадцати. Around 3, there's the unusual form, около трех. Around 12, около двенадцати. Now let's combine some numbers with nouns. So again, all of these are going into the genitive plural. Again, we're going to revisit this issue in book 4. This is rather a tricky topic, but for now it's fairly limited, right, and not too difficult. Around 2 minutes, около двух минут. Around 24 hours, около 24 часов. Okay, so all of that is going into these genitive forms. Около 24 часов. Another way to say that in Russian would be около суток. Sutki is kind of a funny plural-only noun that means basically a 24-hour period. Okay, anyway, 5, around 5 hours, около 5 часов. Around 5 minutes, около 5 минут. Around 3 seconds, около 3 секунд. Or 10 days, около 10 дней, and 60 days, около 60 дней. By the way, very quickly, I'm not sure we mentioned this in this chapter. Another way to give approximate numbers that's extremely common is to simply switch the normal word order of the number and the noun, right? So let's take, for example, 2 hours, right? That would normally be два часа, right? Два часа. So we could say около двух часов, meaning around 2 hours, or you could simply say часа два. Часа два, and by flipping the word order, that immediately implies around 2 hours, and that's extremely common in Russian. And I would dare say it's more common than using около, although you can always use около. Okay, so now that we know these genitive forms, we can get to the second half of the part of the picture here. What about the second half of the hour, right? So we're past 12:30 or 1:30 or whatever, leading up to the following hour. Then we get basically без. Again, we start out with minutes. We're thinking minutes first, but we're saying now we're with, for example, without 1 minute. It's 1 minute till 1, or 2 minutes till 2, or 3 minutes till 3, or whatever. Right, so in Russian we say without 1 minute, and then we give the hour. So 12:59 would be literally without 1 minute, 1. 1:58 would be without 2 minutes, 2, right? 2 minutes to 2. 2:57 would be without 3 minutes, 3, right? 4:56 without 4 minutes, 5. 5:50 without 10 minutes, 6. Right, so again, that's fairly logical, and I think in some ways this is easier than the first half, but we because the coming hour is kind of obvious, right? But the trick here is we have to use genitive forms of the numbers, which isn't easy either. So без одной час, or без одной минуты час, без двух минут два, and again, normally in Russian you would leave the minute word understood, right? It's clear what you mean, so you could throw it in. There's nothing wrong with that, but you don't really need it. Без трех минут три, без 4 минут 5, без 10 минут 6. Okay, now let's get to the quarter, right? It's a quarter till. So we could say without 15 or without a quarter, right? Без 15 7, без четверти 7. Right, we're without 15 7, right? We're leading up to 7. Now what about 7:31? So here, right, без 29 minut 8, right? Without 29 minutes 8. Now again, with these compound numbers, 29, for example, right? We have two separate words, two separate numbers. Those are both going into the genitive, right? So 29, we get без 29 minut 8. Okay, so let's fill in some times for the second half of the hour. Again, answering the question, сколько сейчас времени? And here, again, as always, we're thinking minutes first. And in this case, we have to do a bit of math, right? We want to say, for the time 5:31, we want to say without 29 minutes, 6, right? Or again, in English, kind of like in English saying 29 till 6 or something. So, без, without 29, без 29 minut, again, throwing in minut is sort of optional, but why not? Без 29 minut 6, right? So again, without 29, 6. Okay, PM, that would be evening, I guess. We'd say вечера. Okay, 12:59 a.m. So that's going to be ночь, right, in the middle of the night. So we want to say without 1 minute, 1. Без одной минуты, or без минуты, 1 ночи, right? Ночи would be the equivalent of AM. Okay, 3:42 a.m. Again, also quite early in the morning. So let's say without, I'm not very good at math here, without 18, right? Without 18, без 18 4, right? Without 18, 4. And I guess I would say ночи, but again, who knows? Some people may say утра. I would guess ночи would be better. Again, I think there's a bit of gray territory here with some of these times of the day. Okay, 4:40 p.m. So without 25, без 25, dня, I guess we'd say. I guess I'd say that's probably still daytime. Now again, for so many of these times in the day, right, for the early PM and even into evening, you don't really need to specify PM necessarily because you would normally assume that in most contexts, right? Okay, 6:50. So without 10:07, без десяти семь вечера, right? That would be evening. Okay, 7:36 a.m. without 24:08, right? Без двадцати четырех восемь утра. Okay, 11:45. So here we have two options, right? We want to say without 15, без пятнадцати, or without a quarter, без четверти 12, 12. Без пятнадцати 12, без четверти 12 утра. Okay, 1:42 p.m., right? So again, we could say dня here, but probably we could just leave it understood. So let's say without 18, 2. Без 18, 2. Right? Без 18, 2. Okay, 10:57. So without 3, 11. 3 to 11. Без 3, 11 вечера. All right, 8:33. So without 27, 9. Без 27, без 27, 9 утра. Okay, so that does it for telling time. So the worst is over. Now, one question you may have is how do we tell at what time something happens, right? So far, we've just simply been stating the time as if answering the question, сколько сейчас времени? Okay, so, and basically the forms we've been given, we could say that they're basically nominative, right? They're just the basic forms of the number followed by whatever we require. So how do we say at what time? Well, it's pretty easy, actually. We use v plus the accusative for most of these time expressions. So, for example, look at the possibility number 1, right, which is with v. We use that for time on the hour and in the first half of the hour and also for the halfway point, right? So, в 2 часа, в 5 минут третьего, в полтретьего. Okay, so the time expression itself is just like the ones we learned before. We're just simply adding v in front of it. And because v here is taking the accusative, these accusatives basically look just like, again, what we might say were the nominative forms we were learning earlier. Now, again, if you want to jump to book 4 and learn how to decline numbers in full, right, you can go to, I think it's day 168 in book 4. But again, so the trick is with numbers, right? There's a lot to be said here, as you'll find out to your horror in book 4. But for most practical purposes, for numbers, you've got the nominative, and then you've got accusatives that are usually going to look like the nominative, right? And then today we've also seen some useful genitive forms as well. So basically, the fact that v here takes the accusative doesn't really make much difference for us, right? The forms remain unchanged. Okay, what about bies? What about the second half of the clock face? Well, if we think about it, these times start with bies, which is a preposition. So how would we use bies as the object of a preposition? Well, we wouldn't, right? It doesn't really make very good sense in Russian. And so we simply drop the v, right? We simply say bies bt 3. That could mean, it is 2:55 or we're meeting at 2:55, right? Bies bt 3. Okay, finally, genitive forms of numbers with animate accusatives. Okay, so now we're getting into some trickier territory that we're going to revisit in detail on day 166. But so let's just think of this issue, right? Just worrying basically about nominative forms versus accusative, and what do accusatives look like? Okay, well, this is sort of as we might expect, right? If we're talking about something inanimate, we would not expect a change in the accusative, right? So, for example, if we're talking about две новые книги, what if we bought those things? They'd be accusative, there would be no change. Я купил две новые книги. That makes good sense. Okay, пять новых книг. Okay, пять, again, that's basically an E noun, which we know doesn't change in the accusative, even though it's feminine, right? So я купил пять новых книг. Again, no change moving from, again, what we might call the nominative пять новых книг to the accusative of that same time number construction. Okay, what about animates? Okay, now we have to break things down a little bit. Let's start with one, right? Remember, with numbers, we're always worried about these three categories: one, then two, three, four, then five and above, and then again, compound numbers are usually dictated. They usually are determined by the final component. Okay, so let's start with one. For animates, for example, one new student. Я вижу одного нового студента. Okay, so that's masculine animate. It's looking like the genitive, as we would expect. Now, by the way, if this were a female student, we'd be back to the ada u yada u, right? Я вижу одну новую студенту. What about 2, 3, 4? Okay, this is maybe somewhat unexpected, but not entirely illogical, right? Two new students, male or female, we would expect those accusatives to look like genitive forms, as we've learned, right? So, я вижу двух новых студентов. That makes perfect sense, right? And feminine would be the same story, right? Я вижу двух новых студенток, right? Again, looks like genitive forms. Now, for 5 and above, we get something that's maybe a bit unexpected. I think the best way to think about this is that пять, it's an e-noun, right? And it's a number after all. It doesn't necessarily refer to anything, to a person. So you can think of these пять and above numbers as inanimate nouns, and so they basically absorb the force of the accusative, right? They go into the accusative themselves, but everything that follows remains unchanged, right? So if we have 5 new students, пять новых студентов, right? We know that 5 is followed by the genitive plural. Now, if we make that accusative, we might expect something like я вижу 5 новых студентов, right? In order to keep it all in the genitive, right? Because animate accusatives look like genitives. But that's not what we get, right? Я вижу 5. I see 5, and then what follows is again just dictated by 5. 5 новых студентов. Okay, now compounds would act the way we might expect generally, except for, well, let's say, for example, 22, right? This is the one that's maybe a bit weird. Я вижу 22 новых студента. Right there we get, again, you can think of 20 as sort of being in the accusative, and then what follows doesn't change, right? So we don't get двух, for example. We get два. Okay, but here we're getting into some really tricky territory, and you see it's not entirely consistent, really, perhaps. And we're going to come back to this in full detail on day 166, right? So there is more to say about this. There are more examples we could give. It's a very tricky topic. I think even native speakers can get tripped up by this type of thing. So I don't want to belabor this too much right now. Okay, so let's do a few of these, and let's imagine we're buying these things just to set up an accusative, right? Я купил or я купила. Okay, I bought 2 small cats. Okay, so that's animate, right? So we would expect this to look like the genitive, and it does, right? Я купил двух маленьких кошек, right? And there we get agreement across the board there, genitive forms everywhere, and actually genitive plural forms, we should point out. Okay, number 4, 4 small puppies. Again, same type of example. Animate accusative looks like genitive plural basically across the board. Я купил 4 маленьких щенков. Again, genitive plural. Okay, I bought 5 Russian dictionaries. Okay, again, here the number 5, well, we have an inanimate noun to begin with. Right on top of that, the number 5 is always going to be treated like an inanimate, essentially. Я купил 5 русских словарей. And similarly, 5 Russian dogs, even though it's animate, there's no difference here. Я купил 5 русских собак. Okay, I bought 3 horses. Animate, right? Я купил 3 коней. 3 коней. All right? Again, that's all now going into what looks like basically genitive plural, right? Okay, 22 parrots. Okay, so here's a compound example. And again, we could think here for 22 of the noun, the number 20, just sort of absorbing the accusative. It's sort of acting as your direct object, and then what follows is unaffected. But again, that's not necessarily something we might predict, but that's what we get. So я купил 22 Sorry, 22 попугая, simply. 22 попугая. Okay, I bought 21 Russian books. Okay, this one is going to decline. Basically, один always acts like an adjective, right? So it's going to always agree with the noun. So, я купил 21 русскую книгу. Now, again, you see how there are some inconsistencies cropping up here, right? Because we just said earlier that, the first number in a compound, the first component in a compound number, like 20, can sort of absorb, it can sort of act as your inanimate accusative and so forth, and what comes after doesn't change, but it doesn't always hold up. So this gets very confusing very quickly. Okay, number one, I bought one white mouse. Я купил одну белую мышь. Okay, that's predictable, right? Just putting it into the feminine accusative, singular. I bought 3 black goats. Okay, that's animate, right? 2, 3, 4. That's all going into the genitive here in what is actually the accusative. Я купил 3 черных козлов. Right, again, we need genitive plural now. And I bought 52 hamsters. Я купил 52 хомяка. Okay, so this stuff, again, as you saw today, you're getting a little glimpse of what we're going to see when we cover this issue more exhaustively in Book 4. It is a bit of a mess. I always like to try to point out to students that if you find this confusing, you're in good company. And so, but beyond that, there's really not much to say, right? We just have to kind of learn these forms while appreciating that a lot of them are not entirely predictable or even sort of internally consistent, right? It's a very confusing topic. But I hope you've seen that, of course, some of these examples, like with these compound numbers, they're relatively unusual, right? So the examples we give today with the single digits up to 10, the teens maybe, some of the tens, you may be likely to hear, especially in time expressions like from 2 until 4 with the genitive and things like that. Those, of course, are extremely common. But, the higher you get up into kind of fancy, long compound numbers, the issue of what to do with them in different cases is certainly important in the sense that I guess we should know it, but it's not something that comes up nearly as often in just everyday speech. And for that reason, by the way, some Russians, even native speakers, I may have mentioned already today, they may get tripped up a little bit when they're forced to do that because it's not something you're doing just on a minute by minute basis, right? Okay, so anyway, there's a lot more to say about this, but we're gonna save that for later, luckily. So for now, до свидания, товарищи, и вперед к новым победам.